He said he filmed it to keep a memory, but the only memory I have is of our pain tied up in his room. My name is Lorraine Jenkins. I'm 76 years old and I'm from Macon, Georgia. And look, if you think old people don't have heavy stories, it's because you've never really listened. I was brought up in that kind of home where everything was about family is sacred. But nobody warned me that sometimes the worst comes from family. I was only 11 when it all started. And do you know who the sweetheart was? My cousin Thomas. He was older, already 19 at the time. Tall, rosy-cheeked, the kind of guy aunts used to say, "That boy's going to be a pastor, look how quiet he is." Too quiet, too quiet. A silence that I now know was hiding something bad. My Aunt Marla, my mother's sister, came to live with us after she lost her husband in a truck accident. She was sweet, a bit quiet, always saying that God has a plan, and she took Thomas with her, a room just for them, at the back of the house, where the corridor was dark and no one passed by without reason. I slept in the front room with my younger sister. But that soon changed. Thomas had a camera, one of those old, heavy ones. My father thought it was beautiful. He said it was nice to see a boy with a healthy interest. He filmed everything: dinner, chickens in the yard, even people doing their laundry. We laughed and posed, until the day he asked to film a joke. It was a Saturday afternoon. I remember because my mother had gone to church to clean the pews with the sisters from the prayer circle. I stayed at home with a headache, and Aunt Marla stayed because she kept getting sick. Thomas appeared with a camera on his shoulder and a crooked smile. "Lorraine, come into the bedroom quickly. I want to show you something I saw on television," he said. I did. Of course I did. Children don't question older cousins who everyone praises. I went into the bedroom and he locked the door. At first, he laughed. He said it was a joke. He showed me an old iron handcuff. "It's just a scene, just like in a movie. You're going to be the detective, and Aunt Marla is going to be the bad guy. It's just for the record, then we'll watch it together." Aunt Marla was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed, with a strange look on her face, a little lost. I thought she knew what was going on. Today, I know that she just didn't have the strength to get out of there. She was already trapped in a way that didn't require a key. He put the camera on a tripod, turned it on, and began. "I'm not going to tell you everything now, darling, because it wasn't all at once. He was clever. It was like weaving a web, little by little, until you don't even realize you're already inside. That day, he didn't do any of that yet. He just told us to perform. He told me to handcuff Auntie. Then he handcuffed me too, laughing as if it was all a joke. Now stay still, that's the scene. You're under arrest, and you can't talk." He filmed it for minutes. In silence, the camera rolling. We were there, and him, standing there, watching, smiling, a dry smile that didn't go well with any kind of joke. When he let us go, he gave us a lollipop and said, "If you tell, you'll miss the next episode." And the dumb child here thought it was some kind of game. Aunt Marla just lowered her eyes, as if to say, it's better not to contradict. That night, I slept badly. I dreamt about the handcuff. I woke up with the feeling that it was going to continue, and it did. The following week again, and the next, and then it became routine. But calm down, my dear. Don't skip any steps. Because at the beginning, there were still a lot of people pretending not to see, and I, silly me, still thought it was all going to stop. But the room got darker, the game got weirder, and the silence in the house, deafening. Leave a like, baby, because this old lady is going to open her soul now. I can't say exactly when it stopped feeling like a game and became a real prison, but there was one day that stuck in my mind as the beginning of the end. I was already 12, and Thomas started calling me alone. He used to make a point of leaving Aunt Marla along, as if her presence was some kind of relief or protection. But over time, she stopped reacting to everything. She became a shadow. He'd tell her to sit down, be quiet, look straight ahead, and she'd do it. She didn't even blink, as if her body was there, but her soul had escaped through some crack in that locked window. I still believed that if I was good, if I did everything right, he would stop. I tried to be polite. I smiled. I pretended it didn't bother me. I even imitated those actresses from the movies he watched hidden in the basement, as if it were some sick soap opera where everyone pretended and no one escaped. I began to notice that he became more agitated when my mother wasn't at home. He would hear the door slam, look at the clock, and come after me. He always had an excuse. He wanted to show a new scene, test the camera, rehearse a story. It was never just a visit, never just, let's talk. It became an invisible routine, which only existed inside that room with the locked door. And I learned to hear the sound of the key turning, like hearing the crack of a bone being broken. The first time I tried to tell my mother was on a Sunday. We were washing dishes together, and she commented that Thomas was very helpful, that he helped with everything, that he went to church, that he was a blessing. I froze. The sponge fell out of my hand, and I said, "Mom, Thomas does some strange things." She looked at me quickly, but with that look in her eyes that's ready to deny it. "What kind of things, Lorraine?" And I, a coward, pretended it was no big deal. I said that he told me to stay in the room a long time to record some nonsense. She laughed. She said I should get used to it, that he was an artist, that I should be happy to be the star of the videos, and she went back to washing her glass as if nothing had been said. That night, Thomas called me. He didn't say anything, just pointed down the corridor. I went in. He locked the door and remained silent. He walked slowly over to the bed, turned on the camera, and sat down. He stared at me for a good few minutes until he said, "Have you spoken to your mother?" My whole body shook. "No," I lied. He didn't answer. He stood up, took the handcuffs, and told me to turn around. I obeyed, and he filmed it. But this time, it was different. There was no staging. There was no script. Just him walking around as if he was waiting for some reaction. But I didn't cry. I didn't ask, nor did I complain. I just stood there, accepting everything. Because I understood that any attempt to resist would only make things worse. Months passed like that. Time in that room seemed different. I grew, my hair changed, my body changed, and he continued with his obsession with controlling everything, recording everything. There were days when he called my aunt too, but she was no longer a person. She was just a piece of scenery. Sometimes he would leave the recording running for hours, even without doing anything, just to see us sitting there, silent, waiting. It was as if he wanted to eternalize that captivity, as if each tape was a reminder of his power. And there was a particular tape, one that I still remember the cover of to this day. It was a black tape with a red label on which he wrote in pen, "Confidential 1973. He kept it separate. I saw it once when he sent me to get a blanket from the back cupboard. I accidentally opened it and saw all the tapes stacked up. But this one was alone, in a corner, wrapped in a cloth. When he realized I'd seen it, he yelled at me like never before. He made me kneel on the bedroom floor and repeat 5 times that I was his, that I couldn't go through his things, that if I told anyone, no one would believe me. I repeated it, trembling, sweating, and wanting to disappear from the world. The worst thing of all, my dear, was to leave that room and pretend that nothing had happened, sitting at the table with the family, eating rice and beans, as if my soul hadn't just been crushed. My mother smiled, my father made jokes, and there I was, a broken doll that nobody saw. And my aunt? She sat next to him, not saying a word, chewing slowly, her eyes always lost somewhere in the void. Sometimes I thought she was an accomplice. At other times, I was sure she was just another victim, like me. But then came the day when I decided to react. Not in the way you're thinking, with a shout, with a complaint, nothing like that. I was just a girl. But I started paying attention to the time, the footsteps, the sound of keys. I wanted to understand how he hid everything so well, because if I wanted to get out alive, one day I was going to have to outsmart him. And that's when I noticed a detail, a small notebook he carried in his pocket. He wrote everything down in there, the days, the hours, even what we wore. That was the map of the prison, and perhaps also the key to getting out of it. It wasn't long before that little notebook became my obsession. I would think about it at night, waking up, remembering the brown cover, the yellowed pages, the pen he used, always the same. Fine point, neat handwriting, as if it were a proud diary. That's where he recorded everything. It gave me goosebumps to imagine what could be written there. Because it wasn't just a record, it was control. As if every word was proof of the power he felt he had over us. And I, who until then had just been trying to survive, began to want to understand how he worked. Because to get out of that situation, I needed to get inside his head. And that, my child, is not something a child should do. But life pushed me, and I went. I started looking in his pockets. He kept his notebook in his shirt pocket when he was at home, and in the back pocket of his pants when he went out. Only sometimes, when he was concentrating hard on the tapes, he'd leave it on the bedside table. That's when I planned to go in, but there was never time. He wouldn't let it go for more than 2 minutes. The first time I tried, I almost got caught. I said I was going to the bathroom, but I diverted to the bedroom. I sneaked in, stretched out my arm, and heard the key turn in the door. I locked it. I hid behind the curtain, my heart pounding in my mouth. It was him, coming back to pick up the tape from the day before. He passed so close that I could smell the lotion he was wearing. I almost fainted with fear, but he didn't see me. And at that moment, I realized that I might be small, but I wasn't stupid. If I used my fear to my advantage, I might be able to turn the tables. I rehearsed for weeks. I calculated the times, tested the sounds in the house, pretended to forget things just to save time. And then, one rainy March morning, when he went out to help the neighbor with his car, they left the door open. The house was empty. My mother was at the market, Aunt Marla was lying down, curled up as usual, not even strong enough to ask where I was going. I went into his room. The strong smell of mold, mixed with cigarettes, gave me the willies. But I kept going. The notebook was there on top of the dresser next to the camera. I picked it up. I opened it carefully. The first few pages were innocent. Shopping lists, movie names, notes on school timetables. But then, everything changed. There were dates, names, even codes. My name written several times, followed by numbers and strange phrases. Session 12, Lorraine with white tape. Session 19, Marla absent, incomplete recording. Session 27, positive reaction, maintain stimulus. My stomach turned. This was much more than I had imagined. It wasn't just mania, it was method. And there, on that sheet of paper, he made it clear that he knew exactly what he was doing. I ran back to my room, hid a sheet of paper that I'd torn off, folded and stuck in the bottom of my old doll. The one that nobody cared about anymore. The one that was lying in the corner. It was my only hiding place. The following week, everything looked the same, but I wasn't the same anymore. I had a piece of the truth with me. I knew that one day it could save me. But the more I touched it, the more dangerous it became. Thomas started to get nervous, paranoid. He changed the place of the tapes, locked the drawer of the cupboard, talked to himself. I could tell he sensed that something was changing, and he didn't like losing control. He started following me around the house. If I went to the bathroom, he'd listen behind the door. If I spent too long in the yard, he'd call out. It was as if he was surrounding me again. And Aunt Marla? She just got paler and paler, quieter and quieter. One day, I went into her room to try to talk. I asked her if she didn't want to run away with me. She looked at me with such a deep, sad look on her face and just said, "It can't be done, Lorraine. He knows everything." I was breathless. What was all this? What else did he know? It was as if everyone was tied up inside, with chains you couldn't see. And then came the moment when everything really started to fall apart. One day on my way home from school, I found the front door open. That never happened. I walked in slowly. The house was in a strange, heavy silence. I called my mother. No one answered. I walked down the corridor. Thomas's room had its door ajar. And inside, he was watching one of the tapes, alone, sitting on the floor. The flickering television image showed me and my aunt sitting on the bed, handcuffed, staring straight ahead. He was laughing, mumbling things I didn't understand. I froze. I went backwards without making a sound. I ran out into the yard, tried to breathe, but it was as if the air had disappeared. From that day on, I understood that he didn't do it on impulse, out of illness, out of control. He did it because he liked it, because it gave him pleasure, because he thought he was untouchable. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the notebook, the tape, my aunt's phrase. I started to put it all together in my head. Maybe he had something against her, a secret, blackmail, or maybe she'd just broken down inside like I was starting to. I decided I needed help, but it couldn't be just anyone. I couldn't tell my mother, she'd never believe me, or my father. He'd say it was a fabrication. So I thought of the teacher, Mrs. Evelyn. She always said I was smart, that I wrote well, that I had a future. Maybe she would listen. I planned everything. The next day, I took the sheet of paper hidden in my lunchbox. I waited until the end of class. I pretended to have forgotten the book, went back to the classroom and called her. I froze. I couldn't speak. I just handed her the paper. She looked at it. She frowned. She asked what it was. And I, crying quietly, said, "Help me." She read the whole sheet twice with her eyes squeezed shut, as if trying to understand if what was there was true. She didn't say anything for a while. She closed the door to the room, pulled out a chair, and told me to sit down. I was shaking, sweating through my hands, feeling that if she doubted it, I'd never have the courage to open my mouth again. But she didn't. He took a tissue from his bag, wiped his eyes, and looked at me sternly. He said, "Lorraine, this is serious. Do you trust me?" I shook my head. She said that she would take care of everything, that she wouldn't leave me alone, that there were people who could help. At that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt for a long time, hope, but at the same time, enormous fear. Because if Thomas found out, he was going to finish me off, not just with shouts or punishment, but in his own way, with silence, with looks, with the tapes. With that camera that seemed to be on all the time, even when it wasn't recording. Mrs. Evelyn said she was going to draw up a report, talk to the school management, and call in the social services. She asked me not to tell anyone, to act normally at home. But that was the problem, acting normally, as if it were possible to pretend that nothing was about to explode. I returned home that day with a new weight, no longer that of being a prisoner, but that of carrying a time bomb. At any moment, someone could knock on the door and change everything, and I didn't know if I really wanted that, because when you live in hell, the dark becomes a habit. Over the next few days, Thomas became strange. He was quieter than usual. He looked at me suspiciously. He started going through things in my room when I wasn't there. I noticed because my doll, where I'd hidden the torn sheet of paper, was in a different position. It terrified me. I ran to see if it was still there, and luckily, he hadn't opened the seam. But just the fact that he'd leaned against it was enough to knock me off my feet. I spent the night awake, hugging it, feeling like that piece of paper was my only shield. 2 days later, when I arrived at school, I noticed a different atmosphere. The teachers were whispering. The principal called me into her office. My stomach turned. I walked in, and there were 2 women I'd never seen before. One was tall, with round glasses and the look of someone who had seen a lot. The other was younger, delicate, with a low voice. They introduced themselves as social workers. They asked if I felt safe at home. I froze. I took a deep breath and said no. I told them about the room, the tapes, the handcuffs, how my aunt no longer reacted. They wrote it all down. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and seriousness that I'll never forget. But then came the part that scared me the most. They said they needed to come to my house, that they had to talk to my parents, that they were going to do everything according to protocol. At the time, I felt desperate. I begged them not to come yet. I said that Thomas would know it was me, that if he found out, he could get rid of the evidence, hide the tapes, burn the notebook. They assured me that everything would be done carefully, but I could see in their eyes that there was no turning back. That night, Thomas didn't call me into his room. He didn't even speak to me. He stayed locked up the whole time. But I saw him leave at dawn. It was raining, but he still went out with a backpack. I watched from the window. He got into his car and drove off. I went back to bed with a bad feeling. In the morning, the police showed up. My mother was in shock. My father screamed. My aunt fainted in the kitchen. And me, I just sat on the sofa motionless, waiting for what would come next. They'd taken all his equipment, the camera, the tapes, the notebook. They took everything. But Thomas was no longer there. He was gone, evaporated, as if he knew exactly when to run. I was taken to a temporary shelter that night. I was told it was for safety until they found him. My aunt was hospitalized, diagnosis, nervous breakdown, and my parents, well, my mother cried day and night saying she didn't know anything, that it was impossible. My father wouldn't speak to me. He looked at me as if I had destroyed the family. That hurt more than anything Thomas had done, because the outside world, which was supposed to save me, looked at me as a traitor, as if I had caused all this. At the shelter, I met other girls, each with a heavier story than the last. Some didn't speak, others laughed all the time. It was as if the trauma chose different ways of getting out. I kept to myself, watching, trying to understand where it was all going. But then one day, one of the educators came running to call me. They said they'd found Thomas in the neighboring state, in a cheap motel with false papers. He was trying to flee to Mexico. They arrested him. They brought him back. And they scheduled the hearing. When they told me, I felt everything at once. Fear, relief, anger, tiredness, and a thirst for justice that I didn't even know existed in me. I was going to have to face him, to look into the eyes of the man who destroyed my childhood, and tell him everything in front of judges, lawyers, and strangers. What if no one believed him? What if he manipulated everyone again? But I knew that now I had a voice, and it wasn't just for me. It was for my aunt, for the other girls, for every tear shed in that locked room. Only, honey, what happened at that hearing? You have no idea. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm that you knew was coming, but still caught you off guard. They woke me up early, gave me a different outfit, one that seemed to want to hide any sign of what I'd been through. The shelter was silent that day, as if even the other girls knew that something important was going to happen. The social worker and I got into the car and drove to the court. I was shivering, but not from the cold. It was as if my body knew that this moment was going to mark me forever, even though I didn't really understand how. The building was big, cold, full of people who walked fast and didn't look you in the eye. They took me to a smaller room, said it was a closed hearing, that it was for my protection. But what I really wanted was to be anywhere else. When he came in, I felt it immediately. The smell, his posture, the same look as always, but this time, empty. He was wearing detainee clothes, handcuffs on his wrist. He was thinner, his hair was messy, but it was still him. Thomas, my cousin, the man who turned my childhood into a prison with a bed and a camera. He looked at me, quickly. Then he turned away, not because he felt ashamed. It was more like I was nothing, just a piece out of place, as if he had lost control of his favorite toy. It disgusted me. The judge began to speak, explaining that I was going to give my testimony. I was asked if I wanted him to leave the room. I said no. I needed him to listen. I needed him to listen from beginning to end to every piece of the truth that he tried to bury with tape and lies. I took a deep breath. The words started slowly. Then they came with force. I told him about the handcuffs, the aunt, the recordings, the notebook, the time I tried to tell my mother, the fear, the shame, how normal it all seemed to outsiders. She said that he used silence as punishment, that he knew exactly what he was doing, that he manipulated everything, even our reactions. The judge listened in silence. The prosecutor took notes. Thomas's lawyer stared at the floor. And what about him? He stared at me with a calm that made me want to scream, as if he still believed he was going to get out of it. When I finished, my hands were sweaty and my throat was dry, but I didn't cry. Not at that moment. I didn't want tears. I wanted my words to weigh, and they did. And Aunt Marla was called. She came in supported by a nurse. Thin, pale, she looked smaller than I remembered. She sat down slowly and, for the first time in years, spoke in a firm voice. She told me what she'd experienced, how she'd been imprisoned, how he'd threatened to tell her things from the past if she didn't comply. She said that he had videos, photos, and that he used them to silence everyone. And at that moment, the room changed. It was no longer just my word. It was confirmation that he was a monster with a method, that it wasn't an exaggeration or the invention of a traumatized girl. The tapes were shown, but not all of them, just a few, as proof. The faces were blurred, the scenes cut at the right moments to protect us. But even so, you only had to see the beginning to know what was coming next. The jurors saw it. The judge saw it. No one could pretend it was just a joke. When the prosecution finished, the defense lawyer tried to say that he was disturbed, that he needed treatment, that he came from a broken family, but no one there was buying it anymore. At the end of the hearing, the judge ordered that he be held until the final trial, without bail. He was handcuffed again. This time, the chain pulled hard. He stumbled, looked at me, and finally looked away. There I felt something inside him break, and that, in some twisted way, gave me strength. I walked back to the shelter with my head spinning. It wasn't relief yet. It was more of a break between scares. I knew there was still a lot to come. Interviews with psychologists, conversations with prosecutors, visits from people who wanted to know more about the case. I became local news. The newspapers started calling it the Jenkins family tapes case. I was nicknamed the Brave Girl, but nobody knew the price of courage. No one saw the nights awake, the fear of going to sleep and dreaming about the room, the camera, the sound of the key turning. My mother tried to visit me once. She cried a lot, said she felt guilty, that she should have seen the signs. I listened, but I didn't hug her. I was too hurt. I was afraid that if I touched her, it would all come back. My father didn't show up. They said he had a crisis, that he couldn't accept the family's exposure, that he said it was all a setup. What a difficult man. He never understood that what tarnished the family name was not what I told, but what Thomas did. I started writing, first in a small notebook I'd been given, then on loose sheets of paper. I wrote letters to myself, as if trying to understand who I was now, because after someone erases your childhood with tape and fear, you have to reinvent yourself. And I didn't know who I was without that. I was told I was strong, but what I felt was tiredness, a constant weight, as if I were carrying the body of an old woman inside. But I also knew that I had started something that no one else would be able to stop. Only, my goodness, Thomas still had hidden cards, something nobody expected, and when they turned up, everything changed again. It didn't take long for the news that he'd kept more to start circulating. They came to talk to me one evening when I was helping to organize the books in the shelter. The social worker came in with a worried expression and asked me to drop everything. She took me to her office, locked the door, and took a deep breath before speaking. They said that during the examination of his things, they had found a second box hidden in a false compartment in the bedroom wall. Inside were photos, notes, and recordings that nobody knew existed, some even older, others more recent, with records showing him watching other girls in the neighborhood, and worse, written threats, details of places he went to choose his victims, names, times, even sketches of house plans. That put everyone on alert. The case, which was already serious, became a scandal. The prosecutor's office started treating it as a major operation. They called in the FBI, expanded the investigation, and opened a parallel inquiry. My name was again in the papers, now as the key player in something even more rotten than imagined. I didn't understand everything yet, but I could feel the size of the mud. Every detail that emerged was further proof that he was never just a sick man at home. He was a predator, meticulous, and maybe he'd been doing it for much longer than anyone suspected. And what hurt me most was realizing that if I hadn't told him, everything would have stayed the same. because he knew how to hide it. He knew how to smile in front of adults. He knew how to pray beautifully in church. People like a monster with a monster face. The problem is when the monster looks like a good cousin. After that, the days turned into meetings, visits, interrogations. Psychologists, lawyers, police officers, everyone wanted to know something. And there I was, trying to breathe, trying not to lose the little bit of sanity I still had left. The girls at the shelter began to look at me differently. Some with admiration, others with distance. There were people who didn't like it when one of ours became special. I understood. We lived in a place where everyone was hurt, so any attention threw things off balance. I tried not to look different, but inside I was already someone else. I had no childhood left, no innocence, just a desire to see justice. And when I say justice, I don't mean revenge. It's that he should pay with the same loneliness that made us swallow all those years. It was in the meantime that I was called to testify again, only this time for something else. They wanted to know if I recognized some of the names and faces from the new evidence. They had found photos of 3 girls who had studied with me in elementary school. I remembered them. One moved away after the 2nd year. Another disappeared from school out of the blue. The third, I never saw her again. It was as if Thomas had spread his tentacles and no one had noticed. With every question I was asked, I felt a chill in my stomach. It was like reliving everything, but I answered, firmly, because I knew that now it was either that or let him escape again, and I wasn't going to let him. In the midst of all this, my aunt improved a little. She started speaking more clearly, answering questions, even smiling slightly when she saw me. She sent me a letter through the shelter, a folded sheet of paper, shaky handwriting, but sincere. She said she was sorry for not protecting me, that she hated herself for keeping quiet for so long, that she only now understood the gravity of everything. She said that fear consumes you from the inside until all that's left is your body, and that seeing my courage had rekindled something in her. I cried reading that, because deep down, I never blamed her completely. I knew she was a victim too. It's just that in prison, you end up feeling complicit in a crime you never wanted to take part in. As the investigation progressed, the police discovered that he was involved in clandestine forums, groups where they exchanged information, tricks, and material. That rattled the nerves of the whole city. My family name became synonymous with scandal. Some of my mother's neighbors stopped talking to her. There were even people who said it was all a fabrication, that it was a plan to get money out of some lawsuit, because bad people always find a way to defend the indefensible. But there were also people who came to hug me, mothers who thanked me, saying that they were now more attentive to their children, women who told similar stories and never had the courage to open their mouths. And every hug, every note, every look of respect, it was as if a part of me was healing, albeit slowly. But then came the shock, a letter, hidden, written by him, Thomas. They discovered it during a new search of his cell. He had sent it to a fellow inmate trying to give instructions on how to eliminate evidence. He named people. He asked them to clean up their tracks. It exploded like a bomb. It became a federal case. He was transferred to another state, to maximum security, and the prosecution warned the final trial would be brought forward. The evidence now formed a C, incontestable, and I was going to have to take the witness stand one last time. The end of it all, the chance to put an end to it once and for all, but also the risk of facing, face to face for the last time, the man who took the most fragile years of my life away from me. And when that day came, my goodness, that's when the wound tore open for good. The day of the final judgment arrived, and even though I knew it was the last time I would have to say everything out loud, my body didn't seem to believe it. I woke up sweating, my stomach churning, my fingers tingling. The women at the shelter tried to calm me down, said that I had done everything I could, that the worst was over. But nobody really understands what the worst is when the pain is masked as a memory. I put on the clothes they had given me, a simple blouse and pants that didn't show my body. They said it was to avoid exposure, that the court would be full of reporters, onlookers, people wanting to see the circus. I didn't care. Not anymore. I just wanted to talk, to close that loop. When I arrived at the courthouse, the cameras were already at the entrance. A sea of people. Nobody touched me, but everyone looked. It was as if I were a rare animal, a mixture of victim and warrior, but seen with a curiosity that hurt. I was taken through a side entrance, along with the prosecutor and the psychologist. I took a deep breath. I prayed inside, not for a miracle, but for strength. I'm not a church woman, but that day I asked for something bigger than me to hold my hand, because even after everything, fear still lived inside me. I entered the room. The benches were packed, the judge with his face closed, the prosecutor with his papers in order, the defense looking at nothing, and him, sitting in the dock, even thinner with badly cut hair and an orange uniform, but with that same look, cold, calculating, dry. A man who destroyed without making a sound, who used time as a weapon and his family as a shield. I sat where I was told. I stood straight without trembling. When they called me to testify, I went without looking around. I climbed the steps like someone climbing a gallows. But I didn't go to die. I went to kill what he tried to leave alive in me. The prosecutor started slowly. She asked me if I remembered the first day. I said yes, and I described everything. I didn't skip any details. I talked about the handcuffs, the camera, the tapes, the feeling of being locked up in silence. I told how he used me, how he made my aunt take part, how he pretended it was a joke to fool me. I didn't cry. I stood firm, because he was the one who had to fall, not me. Every word was a blade. I could see the impact on the jury's faces. The women in the audience covered their mouths. Some men lowered their eyes. He remained motionless. Then it was the defense's turn. The lawyer tried to reverse it. He said that I could be confusing memories, that my age at the time made it difficult to separate what was real from what was imagined. He called me emotional. He tried to say that I was repeating things I'd read in the newspapers. I laughed. For the first time in the whole process, I laughed. A short, dry, humorless laugh. I said that I didn't need any newspaper to remember the taste of fear, the pain of the metal in my wrist, the smell of sweat on recording nights. He said that memory isn't a movie, it's a scar, and that every time I looked in the mirror, the face I saw was that of someone who had to invent herself again after being dismantled. The judge asked for silence. We continued. The prosecution presented new evidence, excerpts from recovered recordings, parts of the notebook where he talked about future plans, places he wanted to visit, people he wanted to test, a list, a damn list with names, ages, observations, people from the neighborhood, from school, even girls who had never been found. It stopped the room. I saw the judge's face change. I saw the public defender lower her eyes. The case was no longer just mine. It was a history of destruction. It was proof that he was a predator, serial cold. The last to take the stand was my aunt. She came in with the nurse again, but this time she spoke without pause. She said she was threatened from the start, that he said he had photos of her, things from the past that could end her life. She said he made her believe that if she told, we would die. And she believed it. She cried when she said that what hurt the most was seeing my childhood end in front of her and not being able to do anything about it. The room went silent. Nobody coughed. No one moved a muscle. At the end of the trial, the judge asked for a break. He left the room with the jury. They went to deliberate. I sat and waited, my heart pounding in my neck. It took over an hour. When they came back, I read it in their eyes even before the verdict came out of the judge's mouth. Guilty on all charges, continued abuse, coercion, production of illegal material, networking, all of it. Sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. I didn't celebrate. I didn't stand up. I didn't cry. I just stood there, motionless, as if the body still needed confirmation that it was true. He was taken away, handcuffed. For the first time in his life, he was the one who was really under arrest. And I, still burdened by the past, was the one who walked out of the front door. But, my dear, the story doesn't end with his arrest, because the aftermath is where the wound begins to heal on the outside, but bleeds on the inside. After he was convicted, there was no relief. A different kind of silence came, one that doesn't scream but weighs, an emptiness that doesn't make a sound, it just squeezes. I didn't really know what to do with the days. I no longer had the obligation to go to court, nor meetings with psychologists, nor interrogations. For the first time in a long time, nobody wanted to ask me anything. And that's when I discovered that when the noise goes away, what remains are the echoes. And mine, well, they were hitting the wall of my soul non-stop. I stayed in the shelter for a few more weeks. They said they would see where I could stay, because my mother still had no structure. My father had disappeared for good, and my aunt needed constant monitoring. I was alone, really lonely. Not in the physical sense, because there was always someone around, but inside. That loneliness that comes when you realize that the world has moved on, but you've stood still at the point where everything broke. I started walking around the courtyard of the shelter every day at the same time. I walked around without thinking about anything. Then I started sitting on the bench at the back and watching the other girls. Some new ones arrived, others left. No one stayed long enough to form a bond. It was like a passing place, and I didn't know where I was going. Then one afternoon, they called me into the principal's office. They said they had found a lady who was willing to take me in. She was a retired nurse, lived alone, and had no children. They asked if I wanted to meet her. I didn't answer right away. I was afraid. Afraid of getting attached, of trusting, of entering a house again and smelling old cupboards and a locked door. But I accepted, because I couldn't live between suitcases and bunk beds any longer. I arrived at Mrs. Helen's house one weekend. It was a simple building, full of plants on the veranda and the smell of cake in the air. She welcomed me with a hug that I didn't force. She said she wasn't going to force me into anything, that I could stay as long as I wanted, that the room was mine. It was a small room with a neat bed and a colorful bedspread. Everything was very clean but not overdone. It didn't feel like a shelter, no prison or a home. It was just a neutral space where perhaps, with time, I could build some peace. The first few days were strange. I woke up early, even though I didn't need to. I avoided going into the kitchen when she was there. I ate in silence. I didn't answer much, but she didn't demand it. She just said, "Take your time, Lorraine." There's no clock to heal wounds here. I started reading. There was a bookcase in the living room with books of all kinds. I picked up a novel and devoured it in 2 days, then another and another. Reading became an escape, but also a tool. I read to forget, but also to remember who I could be beyond the trauma. One day, she asked me if I wanted to write. She said that writing was a way of organizing the mess inside. I started slowly, a paragraph a night, then whole pages. I wrote everything, from childhood memories to loose thoughts. It was a way of talking to myself without having to open my mouth. As the weeks went by, I worked up the courage to go to the market on my own. I walked 2 blocks, bought some bread, and came back. It doesn't seem like much, but for someone who spent her teenage years trapped between fear and handcuffs, every step on the street is an achievement. I started attending a community sewing workshop. I didn't talk much to the other women, but I enjoyed listening to their stories. Each stitch I made in the fabric was like a knot I was untying inside myself. It was slow, painful, but possible. I received a letter from my mother. It was handwritten, in a firm handwriting, like someone trying to stay upright out of obligation. She asked for forgiveness. She said she had sought help, that she was in a support group, that she dreamed of seeing me. I didn't reply, not because I hate her, but because I still don't know how to forgive absence when you need it most. Maybe one day, maybe never. My aunt sent flowers, small paper ones, made by her at the clinic. It came with a note. "I'm learning to breathe." That touched me, because no matter how much the past had broken us, there was still something between us that resisted. Mrs. Helen never pressed me to talk about what had happened. She only listened when I brought it up. One night, without warning, I started to tell her, from the beginning, without stopping. She just held my hand, let me cry, choke, laugh nervously. She said that I wasn't what he did to me, that my story was more than the pain. I wanted to believe, even if I wasn't sure. Little by little, I came to understand that freedom is a complex thing, because after living under control for so long, even breathing without fear is dizzying. You get used to prison. When it disappears, the emptiness is frightening, but I kept trying. One day at a time, I took a short course in creative writing. A woman from the NGO invited me after reading one of my letters. I thought it was silly, but I went. I ended up enjoying it. I started writing short stories, short, sad, without a happy ending, but true, and it was during this phase that I received news that made me freeze. Thomas had been beaten up in prison, hospitalized, in serious condition. I was asked if I wanted to be informed if he died. I said yes, because I didn't want to be surprised, but what I felt wasn't joy, nor revenge. It was a strange kind of sadness, as if that sealed the story for good, and maybe, just maybe, it would make room for another one to be born. The news that he might die left me for days not knowing how to react. I stared at the ceiling for hours, as if waiting for an answer to fall from the plaster. It wasn't joy. It wasn't pity either. It was something else, hard to name, as if a part of the past was about to erase itself, without me having done anything. I, who had spent so long wanting justice, now saw justice being done at the hands of others, in another cell, far from my control. I wondered if that was fair. I wondered if his end wasn't too easy, because I survived, but he never carried the weight of what he caused me the way I had to. He slept peacefully many nights while I suffocated in nightmares, and now he was there, unconscious, intubated, unaware that the world had changed. I felt angry about that. That week, I didn't go sewing. I didn't write either. I kept turning over my thoughts like someone looking for shards of glass in the dark. Helen respected my silence. All she did was leave tea on the table and say, "When you want to talk, the house will listen." It was strange to realize that even with everything I'd already said, there were still parts of me that never came out. Parts that I'd kept back out of shame or fear, or because I didn't think anyone would understand. But there, with the real possibility of him breaking up, those parts started to want to come out. Not as a scream, but as a whisper. I started writing again early one morning. I took out my blue notebook, sat on the edge of the bed, and started scribbling down loose sentences. It wasn't a story or an account. It was almost a prayer. I wrote to myself, to my aunt, even to him. I said everything I'd never had the courage to say, not to forgive him, but to clean up after him. I wrote, "You tried to put out my light, but it burned inside." When I'd finished, I folded it up and put it in an envelope, not to send it, just to know that it had been said. The next day, I went to the workshop. The women welcomed me with tight hugs, no questions asked. The oldest seamstress, June, said she had missed me. I smiled for the first time in weeks. It was nice to feel that the world could see me for who I was now, not just the girl from the ribbon case. I cut fabric, embroidered a tablecloth, talked about a cake recipe, laughed at a silly joke. When I got home, I saw Helen waiting for me on the porch with a letter in her hand. It had the prison stamp on it. I walked in without saying a word and opened it slowly. It was from the caseworker. It said that Thomas had left the ICU, but was still under observation. They couldn't confirm whether he would ever walk, talk, or think properly again. Brain damage caused by aggression. They wrote that the state would still uphold the conviction, that he would spend the rest of his life in medical custody. I felt nothing when I read that. No pain, no revenge, just a kind of period, as if the monster that haunted me had turned to dust. It was still there, but it couldn't hit me anymore. I started writing again with more force after that. I took part in a competition at the town library. My text was about a girl who learned to breathe after living underwater for years. It won an honorable mention. A teacher came to congratulate me and asked if I was thinking of writing a book. I laughed. I said I didn't even know how to live properly yet, let alone narrate other people's lives. But the idea stayed, and little by little, it became a desire. Not for fame or money, but to record. Because memory is the only thing that time can't take away from us. And if I let my words loose in the world, maybe other girls would find in them a way of not feeling so alone. I received a new letter from my mother, longer, full of confessions. She said she remembered things from her childhood that she thought would never mix with my story. But they were all there. She said she didn't know how to be a mother because she'd never really had one. She asked me to let her see me. I thought. I cried. I tore up the letter. Not out of anger, but because it wasn't ready yet. One day, perhaps. For now, I needed to rebuild myself without her. The wound still throbbed. Helen started teaching me gardening. She said that working with soil heals, and there was something there. Sticking your hand in the root, pulling out the rot, planting again, waiting for the right time to bloom. It was symbolic. It was therapeutic. We made a small vegetable garden. I planted basil, mint, and tomatoes. Every morning I would water them as if it were a ritual. And seeing those leaves growing, even slowly, even after the storm, gave me hope. Because if even the wounded earth can bear fruit, maybe I could too. Time passed slowly after that last letter. Spring arrived, and with it a lighter, less suffocating silence. I started going out more, going to the city center, visiting the library often. Helen said that the look on my face had changed. It was no longer one of fear or anger. There was still a weight to it, of course, but also a focus that hadn't existed before, as if I were looking forward for the first time. And it was true. Not that the past had left me, but I began to carry it with less guilt. I understood that pain doesn't go away. It settles in. It finds a place, fits into the gaps, and we learn to walk even with it there. One day, I was called for an interview at a community college. A professor from the literature course had read my short story in the local newspaper and wanted to meet me. I went without knowing what to expect. They asked me if I was already thinking about studying, about turning my writing into something bigger. I replied that I only wrote to survive, not for talent. She smiled and said that sometimes those who write for a living are the ones who have the most to say. I left with a form in my hand and a new chill in my stomach. It was the first time that the idea of a future had presented itself to me as a real choice. I went home thinking about it. Helen listened quietly, then gave me a new notebook, hardcover, blank pages. She said it was time to write without fear. I stayed up all night just staring at those clean pages, as if it were a sin to dirty them with my story. But the next day, I wrote. Not to tell what I'd experienced, but to create. I invented characters, gave false names to real pain, mixed memories with imagination. It was liberating. For the first time, I was in control of the narrative. Not him, not the fear, not the trauma. Over time, my story became a reference in support meetings. I was invited to speak at a child protection event. I didn't accept right away. I was afraid. Afraid of going back to that internal place that was still bleeding. But then I thought that if someone had told me back then that it was possible to get out alive, maybe I wouldn't have felt so alone. So I did. I got up on stage with a shaky voice and cold hands, but I spoke. Not angrily, not sadly. I spoke truthfully. I told how it all began, how I was silenced, how I found strength in the cracks, how I'm still rebuilding. When I finished, a little girl hugged me. She was about 12. She said she lived with her aunt and uncle, that she didn't always feel safe, but that now she was going to seek help. That disarmed me. I realized that my pain, so long and so dense, could become a light for someone else. And that was worth more than any sentence. I came back from the event exhausted, but with something different in my chest. It wasn't peace or joy, it was presence. It was as if I had finally come back to myself. Helen was waiting for me with tea and corn cake. We sat on the veranda in silence. The orange sky, the smell of wet earth. She looked at me and said, "You're not a survivor anymore, Lorraine. You're a seed." I cried right there, because I understood. Everything he had tried to destroy, I had rebuilt, my way, in my own time, without haste, without perfection. Thomas got worse again. He fell into a permanent coma. They warned me, as they had promised. I didn't want to watch or pray. I didn't even want to know the details. I was just grateful that I no longer felt anything. No fear, no hatred, only indifference. And that, for someone who has already been dominated by terror, is victory. I started preparing to start the course. I gathered documents, organized a simple bag with notebooks, pens, and courage. Helen hugged me at the gate on the first day. She said she'd be waiting in the evening with hot coffee. I walked to the bus stop with my heart racing. It was like I was starting again, but with the baggage of someone who has walked barefoot on glass floors. The classroom was small, full of young faces. I sat at the back and watched for a while. When the teacher asked everyone to introduce themselves, I took a deep breath and said, "My name is Lorraine. I like writing." It was simple. It was enough. They didn't need to know where I came from, just where I wanted to go. The first semester was a bigger challenge than I expected, not because of the subjects or the texts, but because of the interaction. Being in a place where no one knew my story gave me a freedom I'd never had before. At the same time, it was scary, because when no one knows your past, all you show is choice. And I didn't know what to show. For years, I was just the girl on the case. Then I became a symbol of resistance. Then all that was left was silence. There, among people who spoke lightly about books, movies, and futures, I seemed to come from another planet. But I stayed. I stayed, always sitting in the same chair, listening more than talking, trying to understand what it was like to live without fear. A classmate called Emily started chatting during breaks, first about the texts the teacher was giving, then looser things, coffee, music, books. She was kind, but not invasive. She sat next to me without demanding attention. She had a calm manner, the kind that doesn't scare. One day, she invited me to go to the library with her. We did. We sat on the floor between the poetry shelves. She read a passage from Sylvia Plath aloud, then asked me which author I liked best. I replied that I was still trying to find out. She smiled, said that was nice. I felt seen in a different way, not as a victim, not as an example, as someone under construction. Over time, we became reading partners. We exchanged notes with phrases marked in the books. We didn't talk about the past. And that comforted me. Having someone who didn't care about my wound but who respected my rhythm was like a breath after so much suffocation. Helen noticed my change. She said I walked lighter, and it was true. For the first time, the memories didn't paralyze me. They did exist, but as the background to a new canvas I was painting. Sometimes they still came at night in the dark like shadows. But I was able to get out of bed, turn on the light, take a deep breath, and let it go. I started taking part in a creative writing group, small, every Wednesday evening. Simple people, powerful stories. There was a lady who wrote short stories about her childhood in the South, a boy who narrated dreams with so much emotion that it sounded like prophecy, and a teenager who drew more than she wrote, but every stroke was pure poetry. I felt at home. I didn't have to tell them anything. Just write. And in the texts, I talked about what I knew, of pain in disguise, of fear that goes hand in hand with memory, of love that endures even in a hostile environment. One of the texts was read aloud by another participant. She cried. She said it felt like someone had written about her life. At that moment, I understood the power of turning pain into a bridge. I received an unexpected phone call. It was from my mother. She asked if we could see each other. I hesitated, but something inside me told me it might be time. We agreed to meet at a cafe near the station. I arrived early, sat in the corner, and ordered tea. She came in a few minutes later. Her hair was graying, her face was tired, her eyes were misty. She sat down without touching anything. We sat quietly for a while. Then she started. She said she didn't want to justify, just explain. She talked about her difficult childhood, her fear of facing truths, the cowardice that comes when you choose to ignore what bothers you. She said she loved me, even though she didn't know how to show it. He asked for forgiveness, again. And this time, I listened with less anger. I replied that I didn't know if I could forgive him completely, but that I no longer felt hatred. I said that today I understood that some people are too weak to stand up to evil, and that, unfortunately, when that happens, evil grows. She cried. She took my hand. I let her. For the first time in years, it wasn't a hug, it wasn't reconciliation, it was just a touch, a sign that the bridge wasn't destroyed, just abandoned. After the meeting, I went home and wrote about it. A short story about a daughter who meets her mother again in a field of ruins. Neither of them knows how to rebuild, but they decide to sit among the rubble. It was about us, but also about so many others. The following week, Thomas died. The letter arrived from the penitentiary. The official cause: multiple heart failure, a consequence of the trauma he had suffered months before. There was no public burial. Nobody wanted the body. The state took care of it. When I read it, I felt a chill, not of fear, of closure. A page finally turned. I kept the letter in a box, along with the blue notebook, some old photos, and the envelope with my first story. It was my survival chest, a reminder of everything I had faced, but also proof that, even at rock bottom, you can dig for air. After his death letter arrived, I spent 2 whole days without saying a word. I didn't cry, I didn't smile either. I just sat still, watching the house, the garden, the weather passing by the window. It was as if everything was waiting for me to react. But it didn't come as a scene from a movie. It came as a warm relief, a long sigh that didn't explode. It just spread. There was no longer anyone behind the locked door. There was no longer a shadow watching every step. What was left now was just what was left of me. And even that was too much. That night, I wrote for the last time in the blue notebook. Not a short story, not an outburst, just a letter to myself. The girl who came into that room, her eyes frightened, her wrists branded with iron. I wrote as if I were talking to her in the mirror. I told her she wasn't dirty, guilty, or weak, that she had survived everything they wanted to erase, and that now she could rest. Saying it out loud, even if only on paper, was like erasing his name from my skin. I started planning my first book. I didn't know how I was going to publish it or if anyone would want to read it, but that didn't matter. It was a promise I made to myself, that this story, no matter how painful, would come out of my chest and find other hearts that were also in pieces. I spoke to the course teacher. She loved the idea. She said she could help me with proofreading and contacts. Little by little, I built up the chapters, not just the ones about the pain, but the ones afterwards, those of reconstruction, those of hope, because surviving is only the beginning. Living afterwards, that's what takes real courage. I went to my aunt's grave on a cloudy afternoon. I took paper flowers like the ones she used to make at the clinic. I stood there, remembering the woman who was taken from within and still managed to love me the way she could. She said she missed me, that there wasn't a day when I didn't think about how much we were held hostage by the same shadow. But now she could rest too. I left the flowers on the floor, took a deep breath, and left without looking back. I met Emily again months later in a cafe near the university. She hugged me tightly and said she had read one of my texts in a digital publication. She asked if I wanted to join a group of budding authors. I said yes, without thinking. At that moment, I realized that I was no longer hiding. I no longer spoke out of shame. I was someone who had faced hell and come back with words in hand. Helen was still by my side, with her sweet, firm way. She told me that life doesn't give you guarantees, but it does give you time. And that time, when you know how to use it, becomes medicine. One day, I sat with her on the balcony and told her everything I was planning. The book, the meetings, the desire to travel, to meet other survivors. She held my hand and said, "You've become a beacon, Lorraine." And I understood. because what had guided me for so long had only been darkness. Now it was my turn to shine a light. I spoke to my mother again, more often. We still don't have an easy relationship, but it's honest. No promises, no demands. Two women trying to understand each other after everything that failed between us. Sometimes she calls me just to ask if I've eaten. Other times, she stays silent on the other end of the line. And that's okay. Not everything needs to be fixed. Some things just need to be accepted. Today, I live with less weight. I still wake up scared from time to time. I still have days when I can't get out of bed, but they're fewer. And when they happen, I no longer blame myself. I've learned that being strong isn't about always standing. It's about knowing how to get up with what's left. And I got up in one piece, despite everything. The book is out. It's called Girl with the Locked Door. It was read in support groups, schools, women's meetings. I received letters, messages, hugs, people saying that my story had saved others. And that's why I told it. Not to get rid of the past, but to turn it into a bridge. Because nobody gets through trauma alone. And if I can be the hand that someone holds in the middle of the road, it's worth it. If you've listened this far, thank you. Not for the drama, not for the shock, but for staying. Because hearing a story like this is also an act of courage. And now, if you want to give me a gift, share this story with someone who needs it. Someone who thinks they're alone, that there's no way out, that they'll never heal. Because healing is not forgetting. Healing is continuing to remember. Leave a like, dear, because this old woman here is no longer afraid to speak her mind, and now I'm the one recording.